Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Democratic Backsliding in International Relations in the Americas. My name is Steve Levitsky. I am the director of the Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard, and I've got the very good fortune of moderating this event. As all of you know, over the last decade or so, several Latin American countries have experienced varying degrees of democratic backsliding. Venezuela and Nicaragua are the most obvious cases, but I would add Ecuador, Honduras, Bolivia, and El Salvador to the list as well. And other countries from Brazil to Chile to Mexico to Peru confront pretty serious democratic crises. And of course, the United States, which has long considered itself to be a champion of democracy in the region, is now mired in crisis of its own. Not only has the United States backed off its aggressive democracy promotion of the 1990s, but it suffered its very own attempted autogolpe just last month. Today's panel gathers three prominent regional experts to discuss the future of democracy and of democracy promotion in the Americas. Our panelists will address the main challenges to democracy in the region. We will ask what international organizations and foreign policymakers are, how they're responding to crises of democratic backsliding, and we'll explore the role of foreign diplomacy and of domestic civil society in defending democracy. Now, before I introduce our three great speakers, I want to thank our great staff at Dr. Class, as always, both in Cambridge and in the Sao Paulo office, for making this happen. We've got just an unbelievable crew in the Dr. Class staff. I also want to thank the Belfer Center and especially Hussein Khalud for pulling this event together. We could not have done this without you, Hussein, and also the Ash Center for co-sponsoring the event. Now, I'm really pleased to introduce our three great speakers. The three of them have very, very long CVs, so I'm going to try to give you a bridge version so we can actually hear them. First of all, and we'll go in this order of speakers, Celso Amorim is the former foreign minister of Brazil. He's a Brazilian diplomat with a long history of public service that goes back to the 1980s. He served as Minister of Foreign Relations between 1993 and 1994, as Brazil's permanent ambassador to the UN from 1999 to 2001, as ambassador to the UK in 2001-2002. From 2003 to 2010, Amorim again served as foreign minister, which made him Brazil's longest serving Minister of Foreign Relations. Between 2011 and 2014, he served as defense minister. He's also been a professor of political science and international relations at the University of Brasilia and served as a Fisher Family Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Future of Diplomacy project. Second, Susana Malcorra is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs from Argentina. She's the Dean of the IE School of Global and Public Affairs in Madrid, Spain, Distinguished Fellow for IE's Transatlantic Relations Initiative in Madrid, and a member of the Democracy Cluster at the European University School of Transnational Governance in Florence. From 2015 until 2017, Ms. Malcorra served as Minister of Foreign Affairs in Argentina and simultaneously as advisor to President Mauricio Macri, among other things, presiding over the 11th WTO Ministerial Conference that was held in Buenos Aires. Before that, she had a long and illustrious career at the UN, serving as Chief Operating Officer of the World Food Program and Chief of Staff for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Third, Ambassador Thomas Shannon is former U.S. Undersecretary of State, and he's also a senior fellow of the Future of Diplomacy project at Harvard, at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School. Ambassador Shannon has a long, distinguished career in U.S. diplomacy. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the State Department in 2002-2003, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council between 2003 and 2005, Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs between 2005 and 2009, and U.S. Ambassador to Brazil between 2010 and 2013. In 2016, Ambassador Shannon was appointed by President Obama to serve as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the third highest ranking position in the State Department. So it's an honor and a great pleasure to have all three of you here today. Before I hand the mic over, just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, we are recording today's webinar. and it'll be available on the Dr. Class YouTube channel shortly after today's session. Secondly, we hope to see you at future Dr. Class events. In the chat section, we've added links to our online calendar as well as to our social media channels. And finally, we would love to hear from you during today's presentation, but we have shut down the chat function. So if you want to ask a question, you're encouraged to do so, but please do so through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of the session, but you should feel free to send questions through the Q&A function at any point during the talk today. So each of our speakers will go for about 15 minutes, and then that should leave us hopefully a decent amount of time for some discussion. So without any further ado, I will kick things off by welcoming our first speaker, Celso Amorim.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Levitsky. It's an honor to be here, especially because I also, among other things, I have the opportunity to interact again with two persons that I admire very much, with whom I had interacted in the past, Susana Malcorra and Tom Shannon. Well, it's inevitable, Professor Levitsky, you can imagine that in a subject like this one, we have to quote from your book, or at least to mention. I have to say that I had committed the sin, maybe because it was a really very popular book, of not reading it for some time. But I did read before this meeting, and I was really very much impressed. I think, if you allow me to say, it's one of the things that of course, impacts on the reader is that somehow you were able to somehow think on the unthinkable, because how could one, let us say 10 years ago or more, think of the United States going through the trouble that it went, most especially, I mean, if you want to find some very graphic moment, is of course the invasion of Capitol Hill. You know, when you see these guys sitting on the chair, this is something so incredible, because it looked like an end of a system. I mean, you know, I'm a film buff, so it reminded me of the film of Sergei Eisenstein about the Russian Revolution, when there was a young guy sitting in the Tsar's throne. So that, of course, maybe the political signals are here probably the reverse, but in a way, it seemed like the end of an era. I don't know if it will be the end of an era, but anyway, it's a remarkable event, a negative event, and it's very important because, as you said in the beginning, the United States is an example for the world. Actually, when Donald Trump was elected, I don't know if Tom Shannon was still the ambassador in Brazil and if he would follow these things. I was no longer in government, and someone asked me what did I think about the election of Donald Trump. I said, well, there were people that were worried with steel or textiles or juice, ethanol, or whatever. And I said, no, the worst thing about Trump is the example, because it's the biggest or greatest or whatever you call it, democracy in the world can have someone like Donald Trump. Of course, other countries can as well. And I'm very bad at prophecies. I'm very bad at predictions. I always forecasts. I always make terrible mistakes, because actually making mistakes is much easier than being correct, because there are many possibilities of mistakes and only one possibility of being correct. But anyway, I never thought I would be so much correct in the case of Brazil. I never thought that we would have someone, as we have now, President Bolsonaro, with an extreme right wing. I could never think of anything like that. I'll just tell you something. It's a very short story, very quickly, because I think this illustrates the points that you have made in your book about how democracies die, or how they may die, at least. When Lula was elected, I didn't know Lula, never met him. So before, so the first person I called was Cardoso, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was the president, and of course I was ambassador, so I called Cardoso. Also, I was a friend. I was a colleague of Cardoso. Of course, he was much more senior than I was, but anyway, we were colleagues in Itamar Franco's government. So I called him, and I said to greet him and to say how good it was that who could think 20 years ago, 20 years before, that he would be elected president, and then that he would pass the presidency to Lula. I thought that democracy in Brazil was consolidated, was consolidated. I might think, of course, that someone more conservative might be elected. Well, that was possible, or even someone who's relatively, I don't know, authoritarian tendencies, but I could never think that we would have the government the way we have today. I mean, in which there is this, I mean, the same things that you have in Trump, but maybe in a more even aggravated way. I mean, the repudiation of science, the repudiation of civilization, civilizational values, repudiation of human rights, repudiation of climate, importance of international cooperation and multilateralism, all the things that we use to defend, it's just the opposite. And Tom Shannon knows Brazil probably better even than I do because he sees it with more objectivity. It never happened in Brazil, at least during the democratic period. I don't want to go further back, but anyway, even after '85, well, you know, I was very comfortable being ambassador for Cardoso. I was not so comfortable at a certain moment in being ambassador for Collor, but I must say that in broad subjects like environment and human rights, he did rather well. And then I was minister for two different governments, one which was centrist and one which was more left of center. And I felt comfortable because we defended the same values. Maybe the way of attaining them were different, but were basically the same values. There was a consensus that Brazil would promote human rights, democracy. Well, some thought it with a more or less state intervention, more or less income distribution. But anyway, this was the thing. And I think this is important. So what happened in Brazil is very, very interesting. Because again, if you allow me to go back to your book, I mean, it's very impressive that in 2018, you would write in a way that somehow predicts the possibility of what actually, sometimes I was even reading if you had rewritten it, because some of the things that you say about those times are the same things that were used during the final days of Trump, the final months and final days of Trump. But to show that how complex reality is, let me take Brazil. I paid a lot of attention to that. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with everything that you say, you can imagine, but of course I admire the way you say it and admire your research and all that. But let me say one thing which is interesting. I saw the list of countries in which democracy was threatened, and this was 2018. 2018, Dilma had already been impeached by a very doubtful process, and Lula was about, I don't know exactly when you wrote the book, but anyway, Lula was about to put in prison. Well, and we know by the revelations that are coming now, I mean, that came very long ago, but continues to come all the time, how this was a vicious process. I mean, it's not a question to discuss that in depth, but everyone now, almost everyone in Brazil agrees. Even, for instance, the Speaker of the House who just left, he lost the election. He's a center-right, even more right than center, I would say. And he was right. If he had a chance now to vote, he would not vote for Bolsonaro. He would vote for the candidate of the PT. And you have the judge of the Supreme Court saying that, well, Lula deserves a fair trial, something that can never happen. So I don't want to go into the merits and to the details of this case, but we know how democracy is being eroded in Brazil. And this was a very, very subtle process. It was in a way almost a slow motion process, if you take, because it's not only that there was no tanks in the streets, but there was a parliamentary moment with now very clearly, even by confession of the guy himself was the head of the army. There was a participation of the army in the process. There was a participation, very clear and ostensible participation of the army in the case of the Lula imprisonment, because there was a threat to the Supreme Court in a very crucial vote. So all these things happened, and now we have, let's say, I don't know, 10 or 11 ministers who are military. So we have actually a military government which went there. It's not the question that the president was a military. That is possible. You had Eisenhower, other countries had other people. But anyway, it's not that. It's the militarization of the whole thing. Even the health. I mean, everyone knows the disaster that has been the management of health of the pandemic in Brazil. I mean, there was a study by an Australian institution, Lowe's or Lewis, something like that. It analyzed 98 countries. Brazil is the worst. Can you imagine? It is worse than the United States. You can know how bad it is. I mean, even the United States on the Trump. Right? Anyway, so this is a disaster. I mean, absolute disaster. And of course, all that because of personal interests. Everything is politicized. Everything is ideologicized. I mean, our foreign minister called the vaccine that was the virus that came as coronavirus, a communistic virus. It's even worse because you put a geographic, but some people in the United States put a geographic characteristic on the virus. In Brazil, it's not Chinese, it's coronavirus. It's a virus that's communist. Not even in the worst periods of the Cold War, you would see anything similar. So that's why we are going. But I mean, you have the problem with climate, all the cultural, educational, environmental agencies in Brazil were packed with right-wing people. Human rights is going backwards in incredible ways. Things like racism, women's health. Actually, someone who left the government in the United States he said now the flag is in Brazil. So anyway, that's what we saw. It's an incredible thing. So the degradation of the Brazilian system to a point in which I had never seen. Not even, I mean, in the military government, there are horrible things, there was torture and so on. So this is in a way, to some extent, different, although millions and millions thousands and thousands of people are dying because of the pandemic and the management of the pandemic. And in many respects, I have the impression it's not only mismanagement, it's intention. It's intention. Why? What are the internal motivations is difficult to say. But anyway, that's what we see. So I see this is a very crucial moment, and I think the United States has to pay attention on that because, of course, you had an influence. The United States always has an influence, whether it by action, direct action, or whatever bodies, the State Department, who are very well represented here, or CIA, or whatever it is, or the Ministry of Justice, or the Department of Justice, it has an influence. But apart from that, the United States has a very important influence in terms of the attraction of the society. In this respect, the same. I don't know how long I still have, but anyway, in this respect, I would mention that 2 minutes. Okay, I would mention that the same way that Trump was a bad example, very bad example, and it was followed. I don't know what will be the policy of Biden in all respects in relation to Latin America. That's still to be seen. I hope the sanctions against Cuba and Venezuela are lifted. I hope more dialogue is there. But whatever happens, what he's doing in the United States is a good example. And I hope that this would influence us and influence other countries in Latin America. Well, you spoke about Correa, we are now seeing the attempts of a coup in Ecuador, actually, but in the other direction, because the Correa's candidate has about 1/3 of the electorate. The second comes 13 points after him, and they are doing several maneuvers. So the reality is very complex, Mr. Levitsky, that I would hope that the present policy of the United States is the one based on dialogue, respect for Latin American countries, respect of plurality, and that would be the best thing that reinforce our partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Malcorra, you're next.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I made the mistake that we all do, that I'm not unmuting my mic. It's a pleasure to be here with good friends like Celso and Tom. And I would like to start from an angle that is a bit of a historical angle here. And because I think there are things that have happened in recent history that have a weight into what we are seeing vis-a-vis democracy. And I will start with the Berlin Wall, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and what it meant to the world and to the Western world in particular, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the fact that we recognize that this was the beginning of a new era. We had Fukuyama talking about the end of history. We discover all of a sudden that the only way forward and the only solution for the world, the only proposition to the world was this combination of liberal democracy and capitalism. That started an era of optimism, an era of opening, an era of growth, an era where globalization went very, very, very far, and where we as the world saw that there was no limit, that the sky was the limit, an era of optimism, an era of big change. Then 9/11 hit, and 9/11 hit the power at the heart of the power, and a new phase started, a phase of a much a stronger reaction, you know, this notion of the clash of civilizations, and optimism sometime went away, and a different phase started of confrontation. And soon after that, we got into 2008 and its crisis. And there is a huge connection between, from my perspective, between that crisis and the feeling that we all had after the Berlin Wall fell. Because the 2008 crisis brought to the forefront that governments were ready to redistribute resources in big manners to avoid a bigger crisis. And I'm not even passing judgment here, you know, the argument that this influx of resources into the finance sector and into some industries was critical to avoid a crisis like in the 30s. That influx of money went straight and fast, while the common citizen saw himself or herself postpone without any attention the first year, the second year, and the third year. And this is a description of what happened in many Western countries, which show to the citizen, and I was in the US when the 2008 crisis took place, and I remember that contradiction between Wall Street and Main Street, you know, this clear notion that the people in Main Street were not paying attention to. And that somehow governments, and by governments, I mean democracies, were not delivering for them, that there was no one thinking about them. And to me, that's a breaking point where we really see the citizens distancing themselves from governments, questioning in many ways the democratic process, the whole notion of democracy. And I go back to the Berlin Wall, because when the idea of democracy, the liberal democracy associated to capitalism was embraced, we must remember that capitalism was interpreted in the crudest way. I mean, it was capitalism like Reagan and Thatcher interpreted it. So it was a way to think about the role of the government being as little as possible, as reduced as possible, and sort of a free will, free game that again did not necessarily pay attention to citizens. For me, this is at the heart of the problem we have with democracies these days. On top of all of this, while globalization took place, the shifting of jobs and the fact that jobs were going somewhere else had an impact on many people, together with the great new mover, which is the disruption that technology provoked. All this created uncertainty. So in a situation where citizens don't see governments answering to their demands, to their needs, to the most basic needs, where citizens see themselves worse than what they were 10, 20, or 30 years ago, citizens don't see themselves with a better future, it's only clear that there is an insatisfaction there, that somebody will fill that space. And that is happening in many countries in the world, not only in Latin America, not only in the US. It's also the case in countries in Europe. Either there are governments that are not democratic, that are illiberal, or we have stronger and stronger oppositions that represent those values. In the meantime, social media has created another disruption where, in my view, political parties, traditional political parties, have lost their intermediation capacity. And the citizen receives information or values information that comes from places that often steer information without real solid value. And as Celso mentioned, without any scientific proof. And this has been the case during the pandemic, but it's not only during the pandemic. So complex issues, very complex issues, start to be answered through Twitter with very short answers that for sure do not address the complexity of the question, but start to appease a number of people who, out of fear because they don't see their future being better, or they don't see their present being satisfied with the basic needs, people start to hear the voices of other type of approaches to government. And that, to me, is the biggest challenge to democracy. In the case of Latin America, this is combined with a clear distribution that is so uneven that inequality has, even though in many places it improved, like the case in Brazil during a certain period, all in all, Latin America is a very unequal society. And that, again, makes people ask themselves, what is it that is happening that the government is not delivering for us? So for me, the biggest problem we have here is that there is a combination of factors that make society wonder whether the principles and values that were so important, particularly for the ones who live through dictatorships and know what it means not to have those basic values respected. But many people today wonder whether those principles and values are so important or are as important as having their schools and hospitals and basic needs well served, so that they can, as citizens, feel that their children will have a better future. So there is a deep question here of many people asking themselves whether an authoritarian approach is more effective and more efficient than a democratic approach. And many people taking advantage of that. And that, to me, is a very serious concern. Because unless we, the ones who believe in democracy and the ones that believe that that's the best model we can have with the many associated values, can prove to the common citizen that democracy delivers for him or for her, unless that happens, it will be very difficult to reverse this tendency to authoritarianism, to nationalism, to populism that makes the narrative nice and, at least in the short term, gives people the sense that there is a better option. That is, in a nutshell, in my view, what is happening. And that also, combined with social media, allows for people to associate themselves against the system. Some of the references you made about the countries in the region that are not democratic or have backlash, those countries have seen people in the streets fighting or protesting against governments. But those peoples in the street had nothing in common often. They only have one thing in common: to be against the government. If you put two groups together, probably they were discussing for things that were exactly the opposite. So they didn't have anything in common as a real issue, and that's difficult, because how do you deal with those groups? But they all were against the government because the government was not satisfying their needs. So to me, maybe because I'm an engineer and I tend to think about how you land ideas into practical things. What we need is to find a way to make democracy work for the people, deliver for the people the things that people need, so that people will not listen to the sounds that some extreme nationalistic, populistic group or government or party will propose. That is a challenge, because democracy is a model where you have to agree, you have to build consensus, you have to come together, and that tends to be inefficient against authoritarianism. My sense is that unless we find a way to transform democracy into a value that delivers for the people, we are at the risk of losing democracy. And that will be my case, and I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You guys are amazing in terms of timing. I don't know if it's your diplomatic experience or what, but most academics nowhere near as good. Ambassador Shannon, you are up.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you, and especially with my good friends Celso Marin and Susana Malcorra, two great public servants, two great Americans in the larger sense of the word, and two great diplomats who have done so much for their countries and so much for our hemisphere and the world. They've both touched on important issues that I won't return to, except to just underscore that we really are living through a period of time of democratic disconnect. And I think Susana described it to a certain extent. In other words, there is a difference between what people want and what their governments deliver, and especially what their politicians talk about. And this is evident if you dig through all the survey data from the Latino Barometer and other surveys. People want the immediacy of their lives improved. They want more economic opportunity. They want greater resources to give them the chance to turn that opportunity into reality. And they want access to good health care. They want access to good education, and they want the security necessary to live their lives in peace in order to be able to develop themselves. And what's striking about this agenda, which is really the people's agenda, is that it's a social agenda, not a political agenda. They accept at one level the fact that they live in democracies. They accept that they live in societies that, at least in terms of their legal structures, recognize, acknowledge, and support human rights. And they understand and recognize they have a right to vote and an ability to participate in choosing their governments, in allowing for the peaceful transition of power, and that they have a voice in determining their national destinies. What they have doubts about is whether or not they have an ability to determine their individual destiny. And that's what they want, what the American founding fathers would call the pursuit of happiness. And I would say that this is the great challenge facing democracy in the Americas today. Because ultimately, the extraordinary political and economic and social changes that took place in the 1980s and 90s in the first part of this century and allowed the countries of our hemisphere to move from authoritarian governments to democratic governments, from closed economies to open economies, from import substitution driven models of development to models of development built around trade and regional integration, and from relative isolation in the world to globalization. Also unleashed social change in the Americas that was profound and built out a significant middle class throughout the region, reduced extreme poverty and poverty in many countries, and created the expectation and the hope that democracy was going to be able to deliver what military governments and revolutionary governments had not been able to deliver, which is an end to poverty, an end to inequality, and an end to social exclusion, and the creation of an open society in which people could live their lives as they saw fit. In other words, the Americas was really, I think, at a point in which it imagined that it could use democratic governance and democratic governments to create democratic societies. But what has happened over the last decade or so, really, as Susanna noted, with the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and then the commodity crisis, and is that these extraordinary changes that are taking place in the world, the tectonic changes of power, the huge movement of wealth from west to east, the rise of great Asian powers in China and India, and all of the technological changes that we're familiar with has really outpaced the ability of our political systems to manage and address them. And what happens in countries that have weak institutions is that the political energy that kind of flows through these institutions can't be contained by the institutions. And it's kind of like a flood or a deluge in the sense that it overflows the banks. And in many ways, the populism that we're seeing in the Americas today and in the United States itself is really the floodplains of democracy. It's really where democracy goes when its institutions can't channel and control it. And from my point of view, once you're on the floodplains of democracy, you can either kind of grow tyrants, or you can grow new political institutions, new political parties, and new political leaders. You can grow an Hugo Chavez, or you can grow a Franklin Roosevelt. And in many ways, I think that's the large challenge that we face today, which is how do we make democracy effective? How do we make government meaningful to the everyday lives of people? And in this regard, I think that in the 21st century, the base point for democracy, or the way in which people are going to measure their democracy, is not by turning to, say, Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, but by turning to the Indian sociologist Amrita Sen's book, Development is Freedom. In other words, can democracy deliver the goods? Can it deliver development? And can it deliver the kind of open society and the freedoms and liberties that people want? And I happen to think it can. I happen to think we have the political leadership. We have the citizen commitment to democratic processes to do this. But it's not going to be an easy process. And as both Celso and Susan noted, there are people who will take advantage of this moment to pursue their own interests and their own goals inside of democratic institutions and processes, but with purposes that are not democratic. And this needs to be understood for what it is, and it needs to be addressed in a way that can effectively blunt it and turn it. And I think what we're going to see in the Americas emerging is a core group of countries that remain democratic because of the strength of their institutions, and then a core group of countries that are in play and have a period of time of hybrid governments where they're somewhat democratic and somewhat autocratic. And this is where solidarity in the region is going to be so important, because we have to find ways to help those countries back to a track that will take them to a more solid democracy. So I'm hopeful in terms of what the future holds, but also recognize that political institutions tend to be some of the slowest to change as economies and societies transform themselves. And that transformation will not slow down. It will only, in fact, it will accelerate over time. Change has velocity in the 21st century. And therefore our political leadership needs to have the same kind of velocity.
Okay. Amazingly efficient. It gives us a lot of time for discussion, which is terrific. So let me start with one round of questions, and then we'll get back to another. So I've been collecting questions through the chat. They're all of them are excellent. One of them is for Celso, which is to ask you to speak a little bit more about the militarization process in Brazil, whether you think that this trend towards militarizing the cabinet will continue, is likely to continue, and whether we're actually facing a sort of reconsolidation of military power in Brazil, the way we saw for a good chunk of the 20th century. Two questions for Dr. Macura. First is from David Nataram. Hello, David. How are you? And that is asking you to expand a bit on your very interesting point about the centrality, importance of convincing people, particularly in lower and middle income democracies, that it's in their interest to embrace democracy and support democracy. The question wanted to push you a little bit on exactly how to do that. And I guess I would just add that we're facing in the years to come some pretty tough economic times, particularly some very, very tough fiscal times in Argentina and Brazil and many countries in the region. And so I think your point about governments having to deliver the goods is crucial. But how in the heck are governments going to be able to deliver the goods in the fiscally lean years to come? One other question for you, Dr. Makuta, from June, which is a response to your point about the role of social media and spreading disinformation and challenging democracy that way. There's been a lot of discussion of that in Brazil, the United States, and elsewhere. June points out, I think correctly, that social media is also used in important ways to combat authoritarian abuse and the shutdown of information by dictatorships. We've seen this quite a bit in Venezuela. And so do you think that the costs, that the risks, the damage that social media can do outweigh the benefits when it comes to democracy? I will, as you guys answer, and Ambassador Shannon, if you want to jump in on any of those, that's fine as well. Let's go in the same order, and I will collect a second round of questions as you guys answer.
Should I? I don't know. It's the same order. Yes. Well, there are so many subjects that I would like to treat here, and of course, militarization is only one aspect of what's happening in Brazil. I think there is more or less on the line that Susana said, is the loss of a rational discourse. I mean, that's something that has to be recovered. Of course, that's not a simple thing. It's easy to say, but of course, the tweets and all these things are not friendly to a rational discourse. I mean, it's small messages that deal with emotion, especially with hatred and hatred, and it's much easier to raise hatred and fear than to raise love. So anyway, I have said that. But in Brazil, the militarization is a fact that today is it's an object of complaint, even for many people that supported the election of Bolsonaro. And it happened surreptitiously. This was not a military coup in the traditional way, but the military were somehow present. Now, with this book by Vilas Boas, the former head of the army, it becomes clear, at least if you believe in his words, that it was not only his decision, but a decision shared with a great part of the how should I say? I mean, the Portuguese would say alto comando. I don't know, the high echelons of the army, that they should give this alert. He used the word alert to the Supreme Court. By an alert by someone with a weapon is not really an alert; it's a threat, isn't it? And they have all the weapons. So this is what's happening. And I think what is happening is a strange combination, because actually Bolsonaro, when he was a captain, he was ousted of the army, really, and he was considered a bad officer. That was not my opinion. That was the opinion of former president during the time of the military dictatorship, President Geisel. But he somehow was able, very cleverly, able to co-opt the military, who are now in government. Of course, they agree with him, maybe with the anti-left-wing discourse and other aspects of his discourse, but mainly they are being introduced in government, co-opted either for personal reasons, or how should I say, corporation for the reasons of the ensemble of the military people, and now they are all the way. I think even they had the illusion that they would come into government and that somehow they would control Bolsonaro. But what happened is precisely the opposite. It's his agenda that's dominating all the time. And this is more scandalous than in any other place in the pandemic. because the guy who was the general who is there, still in active service, and he actually follows whatever Bolsonaro tells him to do. So this is the tragedy that Brazil is now, as I said, the worst in the world, rated by some, actually, even in the United States, with all the big problems that you have, of course, and that you have the death rate and the contagion rate is going down because vaccination is very, very quick, among other things. And in Brazil, it's still going up. It's an incredible thing, which not to be seen in any other significant country now. So significant size. So and the military are all everywhere, and the military are everywhere. I don't think there is a military style who is there. I don't think it's really a military ideology in the same way that it was in '64, which was it's a mixture. It's a mixture of remnants of the Cold War, which still are present in some of the minds of the military, but it's a mixture also with this sort of control of society. They see everything through an angle of a false nationalism. So you, in order to be nationalist, you must be able to destroy the environment, disrespect human rights. Well, I could go on and on. Ignore culture, ignore plural discussion, and that's what's happening in Brazil. And I don't see this stopping at all, because the person was asking about how I see this as a process. I don't see this stopping. I think probably it will grow at least until 2022, when we have the elections, if we have the elections. And if the election, I mean, I'll end with that. And I think this is very interesting for the sociologists to look at. I mean, I'm sorry, sometimes I've carried on more my political side, but let us say, from a research and from a scientific point of view, for instance, like it happened in the United States, but maybe in a broader way, militia are being armed. I mean, they are receiving all the facilities. Brazil was very restrictive in the past. Of course, there was smuggling and all that, but at least in legal terms, it was very strict about the possession of weapons. And now it's free for all. I mean, it increased like 90% last year, the possession of arms by private people. And these are going to the militia, going to this thing, which in a way is astonishing that the army sees that and doesn't do anything, because even the monopoly of the use of force in the state, which is done through the army, is being lost. So what the fear now in Brazil is that when we come to 22, and actually a fear that was prompted in a way by statements by Bolsonaro himself and other people linked to him, even the foreign minister, is that if you come to 22 and something, and if he loses the election or whatever, similar thing something similar to what happened in the Capitol Hill can be done, and with a difference that maybe the army will not face there and not be in a different situation. I mean, one important thing in the United States was how the armed forces behaved in all this crisis, and I cannot rely the way it is now that the armed forces will react the right way. So we have a big fear of armed militia with a compromised armed force.
Well, I have no experience dealing with panels with diplomats, and I don't know what the hell to call anybody, so I'm just going to give up and go with first name. So, Susanna.
Thank you, Stephen. That's really great. Two very pertinent questions. How are governments going to go about delivering what they have to deliver in the context of post-COVID? This is something that I deeply worry about. It's clear that things were not good pre-COVID in the region, but they are much worse post-COVID, and we are not even post-COVID. We are transitioning into potentially post-COVID situation. Inequality has risen to a level that it goes back in some places to many, many years ago. In economic terms, CEPAL says that we have gone back 10 years on average in the region. And in social terms, they argue that probably we are getting to a 20-year backsliding in the region, where of course youth and women are the ones who are hurt the most. So what we need is dramatic. And everybody's talking now about the digital revolution. So not only we need the investments that are necessary to upgrade the health system, the education system, the basic infrastructure, but we need to leapfrog to the 21st century with digital connection to digital capacities to have an opportunity to be able to have an opportunity in a competing world where digital is the basis. This is a very, very difficult a forecast to make. And here is where I find that another element that is critical to support the region is multilateralism, is global governance. I think we need to find ways for the IFIs, the development banks to get creative and support the region with a space that will provide the opportunity to start compensating some of these losses. Just to give you a sense, on average, Latin America has dedicated 6% of its GDP to these different stimulus packages that have been put in place. The US and Europe are at the level of 20% of their GDP. So more than 3 times what Latin America can afford. And of course, the situation in Latin America is probably more dramatic, or surely more dramatic, than the one in Europe or the US. So we need to find solutions to this problem, and we need the support of the international community here in defining a creative solutions that not only will address the question of debt, but will provide an influx of resources that governments can then use to provide some breathing space. Of course, the private sector needs to play a role here. But my sense is that unless we collectively, as a global governance system, find ways to alleviate the tension, the situation in the region is going to be difficult because governments just cannot afford on their own. They don't have the fiscal space. It will get into a very difficult increase in inflation that will spiral out of control, and we know what that results in. So as I'm sure you know, my heart is very close to the notion of having this global cooperation trying to address some of these issues. So I hope that this is understood and there is a way to address this question. And I know there are people who are working on this, and I know that in the Biden administration, there are people thinking about how to address this through some of the institutions that can help in this regard. Regarding social media, it is true that social media can be of help to raise the voices of the ones who see injustice, that see freedom being curtailed. That's true, and there's no doubt about it. The problem is that social media can also be managed in ways that are very subtle, and where big interests behind can really set the tone and set the conversation in manners that people do not realize. This is not organic, purely organic, as some people feel. It's not organic. So my concern with social media is that when you don't have a real free will in the conversation, but you have interest groups, corporations, governments behind, interested in defining the conversation, the tone and the content, that is very dangerous. And that is what is happening in many places. We have seen that. We have seen that in the States, which is probably one of the most sophisticated places to be able to measure and control this. I cannot imagine what can happen in places where the institutions are much weaker. So I'm not against social media, but what I feel is that social media has become a, 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 a potential monster that can be managed by the ones who are interested in managing it in certain directions. And that's the concern regarding democracy.
Thank you. Ambassador Shannon, did you want to jump in at all?
Sure, thank you. I'll just make a couple of brief comments. First, Celso Amorim said at the beginning that the United States is as an example of sorts and expressed his concerns about the impact of the election of Donald J. Trump, but also his hopes in the election of President Joe Biden. The example extends beyond the elections. I mean, obviously, the decision during the Trump administration to leave the World Health Organization and not to participate in a global vaccination campaign effort helped the fragmentation that was already taking place. First, due to economic nationalism and backlash against globalization, but then was accelerated or accentuated by the pandemic and the response to COVID. And in this regard, it's my hope certainly that the example provided by the Biden administration of returning to the World Health Organization and then looking for ways to see beyond the immediacy of vaccinating Americans to the importance of addressing globally a global pandemic will begin to alleviate to a certain extent some of the fragmentation we've seen. But there's no doubt that this fragmentation has been especially evident throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And a region which was already debilitated in its internal ability to communicate by differing political agendas and fragmentation driven by differences around regional problems like Venezuela has only become more fragmented and fractured. And this has really harmed the ability of the region itself to address the larger problems that face democracy today. And it is my hope that the United States under President Biden and the team that will be working on Latin American affairs will make kind of reconnecting the Humpty Dumpty that was the Americas and rebuilding the communication capabilities, both political, economic, and social, will make it a priority. And in this regard, what Susana Marcola talked about, the importance of multilateral organizations, is absolutely correct. You name the organization, whether it's the OAS, whether it's the Inter-American Development Bank, whether it's the Pan American Health Organization, whether it's any of the panoply of institutions that we have built over time and that have served us reasonably well. These really have to be given a profile and a degree of priority that they just don't have right now. And so it's my hope that this will, if we can find a way to do this, and if the United States can find a way to participate in a way that's helpful and meaningful for all the countries in the region, that it will begin to build a sense of confidence in each other and an ability to accomplish things that could be meaningful more broadly in terms of the well-being and health of democracy.
Thanks. So great questions keep pouring in. I'm gonna throw out 5 more. These are I think all for all of you. So pick the ones that you feel equipped to answer. First one, a couple of people asked about the Biden administration's launching of a sort of renewed project of promoting democracy, this idea of a democratic summit. And a couple of questions on that. One person asked, what should be Latin America's agenda, or the agenda of Latin American democracies at such a summit? And second question was, what would it take for Latin American democracies to really become full-fledged equal partners in the global struggle against authoritarianism? Another question came from my colleague, Michael Chu, who starts off recognizing that the COVID-19 pandemic has been obviously been a tragedy for Latin American democracies, in part for the reasons that several of you mentioned, that most democratic governments are perceived to have failed to respond well to the crisis, perceived to fail to respond to people's most pressing needs. And Michael points out that it seems that only the Lacalle government in Uruguay, one step back, this was also an opportunity, right? The COVID-19 crisis gave governments an opportunity to close that democratic disconnect that Ambassador Shannon was talking about, right? They could have tough conditions, but they could have actually responded to needs and helped to close that confidence gap. But most failed. Michael asked, why is it that Uruguay seems to have succeeded? What is it about the Uruguayans that allowed them to actually, or at least the Lacalle government, to respond much more effectively? Couple of other questions. One questioner asked whether the panelists believe that we're seeing a third wave, a reversed third wave of democratization, or now we're seeing a global wave of autocratization, and whether Nicaragua should be understood as part of that wave. Another questioner asked, says that the panelists didn't say much about the role of conservative elites in pushing back against progressive governments in Latin America over the last decade, Honduras, clearly in Brazil. So the question was whether we could expect conservative elites to embrace the strengthening of democratic institutions in the years ahead. And finally, one question on whether decentralization, whether further political decentralization and the empowerment of local and state governments could be useful in combating the kind of political polarization that is now threatening many Latin American democracies. Why don't we go back in the same order, beginning with Celso?
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, so many questions. 5 minutes, maybe, to deal with all of them.
Yeah.
Let me say, with the world, I have two hands.
Whichever ones you can.
Oh, as a Brazilian poet said, I mean, I have two hands on the feeling of the world. It's not very difficult, not very easy. Well, because there was a specific question about the fight against progressive governments in Latin America. I think this is absolutely true. I don't want to go into the international implications about that. I think there are some international implications, but I'll say the following. For instance, in most cases, you could say that the fact that democracy was abandoned was because some people still felt outside the globalization, they felt as left behind, and so on and so forth. And that's surely true of the United States, probably of the people of the Rust Belt and other people, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into everything that's still. But, and I think Tom Shannon will be able to, maybe, I suppose, confirm that in Brazil it was not the case. I mean, inequality in Brazil diminished very, very steeply. I remember still the first study, the first time I read about the Gini coefficient was by this famous economist. Whenever I came to an age that I can forget the name of everyone that I deal with. Very good friend of mine who was in Colombia and dealing with Brazil. He was the first time I read about the Gini indicator and how it went, how it was getting worse and worse in Brazil. And it improved very much, and many people had their lives were better. So what was the reason, really? What was the reason? It cannot be said that or there was no attack on democracy on part. I mean, you can say that. I don't necessarily agree with everything, but you can't say that about Venezuela or Ecuador, and Brazil has its share of problems, especially with Ecuador, as Tom knows. But I'm not necessarily agreeing with your argument on that on the book. But anyway, it was not the case in Brazil. There was never a journalist that was put in prison, not even threatened in any way. Nothing like that. Freedom was complete, neither by Lula or Dilma. And the situation of people had generally improved. The last year of Dilma's government, it was a difficult year, the two last years, but especially the last year because it was part of a global crisis in a way, the commodity price and so on. So what made, why democracy went back in Brazil is a different question. The answer is different, I think. It was not because most of people were tired of government, because they felt abandoned. That was not true. We had affirmative action in universities. You had many other things like that. You had distribution of income. You had better situation for the, anyway, and rich people were also getting richer. So it's difficult to say. I think there is the culture of inequality that's very strong. It's very strong in any country. And I think this is the fundamental battle that's being fought in every country and in the world. Those who want a world that has more solidarity, that's more interaction between people, and those who want to preserve their things without with the detriment to everyone else. That's true of the those who support the Confederate flag in the United States, and that's true in Brazil of people who say, "I will never." There is a congressman who has just been put out of, has been in prison now, and he said, he said, "I will never give a job to a black person." This is a congressman. Can you believe that? It's incredible. So that's the kind of thing that also, I think when you have progress, when you combat inequality with affirmative action, with income distribution, those instincts, those bad instincts are again somehow roused. And let me say one thing, and I think that happens with manipulation also. And here you have a question: why the elites in a country like Brazil do that? Because they want to preserve inequality, and they don't want to see the country more affirmative. They have their own links with the foreign interests, and I think this is something that was true in Brazil. Whatever you call it, and of course I'm not defending everything that happened under Vargas government or under Goulart government in the case of Brazil, but whenever you had in Brazil a combination of a government looking for more independence in foreign policy and more social justice inside, the two things together, there was an alliance, an unholy alliance against the government and the provocation of the downfall. That's what happened with Vargas, with Goulart, and Dilma Lula, let us say, because it's the same project, the same process. But let me say one thing, because I think this is very important for how the United States, you have very powerful weapons, good ones and bad ones. And let me tell you one thing that I find important is the question of anti-corruption. Of course, everyone has to combat corruption. We have to combat corruption, both in government and in business. Sometimes even the private business, I don't want to give examples, but all of you know what I mean. But you have to be careful because it's a very powerful weapon, and it gives passion to the people. And that's very, the same way that Trump threatened Hillary Clinton to put her in jail, that's the same thing that they did in Brazil. But the only difference, because there is this extreme inequality in Brazil, that worked in a very bad way. So I think you have to be careful because this anti-corruption is part of your documents on national security. To some extent, even it took place of the war on terrorism, you have the war on corruption. And it's fine fighting corruption. I'm all in favor of fighting corruption. I am all in favor of combating impunity, but it's a very powerful weapon. And so don't use it in a way that can have a result, which is the one that we're having in Brazil. You just mentioned, for instance, democratic governments mismanaged the way of the pandemic. But in Brazil, we have an autocratic government, and it mismanaged in a much worse way, maybe than most other countries. So I don't want to go into the logic of the pandemic, why some countries have high rates and other countries have other rates. This goes beyond what I can tell now. But I think all these things, I think the fact that we have now two visions of humanity, one which is more in search of solidarity, the other which is more egoistic and particularistic, that's true of all society, in all society. And in this respect, the Biden administration, by example, more than anything else, and by respect, by dialogue. I read a very interesting, I will finish with that. I read a very interesting article recent by Joseph Nye, your colleague there in Harvard. I think he's still in Harvard Kennedy School, I believe, I don't know, but I met him once there. Joseph Nye wrote a very interesting article about US intervention. And he said, well, the United States always intervenes in the sense that it wants to have influence in other countries. To that extent, is normal. What changes is the motivation and the means. I don't want to go into the motivation because the motivation may be true or not be true. But the means, if you want to have influence by dialogue, have influence by persuasion, have influence by example, not by sanctions, and certainly by not helping some right-wing forces that are really against democracy in our country.
Thank you. Susana.
Let me chip in here. I'll try to go through the questions, starting with the Democratic Summit. I have to say I'm a bit concerned about the Democratic Summit. I think that is a dangerous proposition to start by gathering a summit. The US has gone through a difficult exercise and the institutions were resilient and things went out well, but the challenge to democracy was huge and is not said that in 2 years' time, when there is a new election, where the chips are going to fall. So first thing I would say, if there is a summit to be called, it has to be done from a very humble perspective, because historically, the US has been sort of the guardian of democracy. Well, the US is at a different place now. And I will say that has to be at the center. You know, if anything, it has to be what we have learned from our own failures, and in being those failures, not only in the US, but in many other places, and to bring in others on equal footing regarding how is it that Latin America will stand there. If I were to advise, and I'm not an advisor to President Biden, I would say, let's not start with the summit. Let's start somewhere else, at least not with the summit for democracy. On Uruguay, you know, I love that country. You know, it's a country that I have always felt is a great example for many things. You know that when Pepe Mujica left, the very same day, Sanguinetti left. Both of them had their final speech said in the very same day, and both of them recognized each other. I think that is one of the reasons why Uruguay is at a different place. Of course, there is a diversity of opinion. Of course, there is a different ideological approach to questions. But when it comes to the issues, they're able to talk and come to an agreement. This society is not as fractured. The tensions are not such that people do not recognize the other one. And I think that is the reason why President Lacalle has been able to manage the situation in Uruguay in a better way. Are we in a situation of reverse, a total reverse of democratization, a wave of reverse, or a wave of moving into autocracies? I don't think that's the case, but I think we run the risk of being there. And then you go to the point that the next question, the conservative wave that Celso referred to, I will not belabor on that, but I will say there is an unholy association of interest that really challenges the question of a rights-based approach. And I've seen these on gender questions, I've seen these on human rights at large. I think part of what happened in the US is that some felt that the rights agenda had gone too far, and then the conservative pushed back and created an unholy association. So I think there is a question of conservative agenda that is behind some of these and associates foreign interest into it. And the last question on decentralization and democracy. I think decentralization helps to deliver. There are certain things that you can really delegate, decentralize at lower level to make the response to the needs of the citizen be in charge of people who are closer, who are nearer. But in the end, democracy has to come together at the highest level. There are certain things at the policy level that you cannot delegate. And while I believe that there is an opportunity to do things to improve the delivery of democracy, I think in the end, democracy has to be at the different levels, and the central level, the national level, is key to define the most important lines of policy, which are the defining ones for the character of democracy.
Wow, you covered all the questions. Impressive. Ambassador Shannon.
Thank you very much. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to be brief, and I'll just start by saying that I think Celso's comments and Susanna's comments are on target and wise, and I'll associate myself with them. In regard to decentralization, Susanna's absolutely right. When it comes, especially to dealing with the pandemic, national responses to problems are the solution. And that's been the issue in the United States. There was no national approach to dealing with the coronavirus. And the Biden administration is trying to put one in place now, but it's a struggle after more than a year of dealing with the impact of the coronavirus. However, when it comes to delivering the goods of democracy, state and local governments are essential, and they can play a hugely important role. And therefore, decentralization can be a very important part of allowing citizens to feel that they can be heard and understood and responded to in an immediate way. And they also act as kind of a brake on the kind of populism that is sometimes driven by national leaders. If you have strong governors and strong mayors who can provide goods. In regard to President Biden's interest in a Democratic summit, he made such a big deal out of it in his speech at the Munich Security Conference that I can pretty much guarantee you it's going to happen. The question is how and how it's structured. And Susanna notes, I think rightly, that it's going to be a big challenge because who gets invited and who doesn't is going to hurt and upset people, to say the least. And then how you structure it and what comes out of it is an unknown. But I think the president has determined that this battle between democracy and authoritarianism is something that has to be addressed. And in many ways, he's doing this to use the world as a way to reflect back into the United States the challenges we're facing in the United States. And so I think he hopes to use it to remind Americans what we have and what's at stake. But in this regard, I think the Latin American countries should have pride of place in this Democratic Summit because of the extraordinary commitment that they have shown to democracy over time. And their belief in democracy, as I mentioned earlier, as a way to address really profound social problems. And this is important because if the democracies of our hemisphere can show themselves to be resilient, if the democracies of our hemisphere can show themselves capable of dealing with pandemics and recessions and commodity downturns and all the rest, and still advance and still make the kinds of, or still be the generator of social transformation, still find a way to deal with poverty, inequality, and social exclusion, and do so within a generation and not 300 years, it's going to be hugely important for the rest of the world that's facing similar challenges.
Thanks, Ambassador. If I could just chip in very briefly on this third reverse wave question. I want to largely agree with Susanna. The international environment is a lot less favorable to democracy today than it was 25 years ago. Back 25 years ago, the United States and Western Europe were the world's dominant military, economic, diplomatic powers. They really were unrivaled, and that's no longer the case for all sorts of reasons. And so the international climate is much tougher. There are storm clouds on the horizon. There's a lot to worry about. But thus far, it's an overstatement. It's I think misguided to say that we're in the middle of a reverse wave. There are as many democracies in the world today as there were 15 years ago, and there are many more democracies in the world today than there were in the 1990s. So there's much to worry about, but and there are a number of high-profile cases in which democracy is broken down, as well as an obvious one. Nicaragua is a smaller country, but it's another clear case. But so far, democracy has proven actually surprisingly resilient, strikingly resilient, including in Latin America. And the thing about Latin America is, for all of the massive, widespread public discontent that all three of our speakers mentioned, there's no real legitimate alternative today to electoral democracy. Latin Americans may be disgusted with their politicians, may have lost confidence in their government, but they have not given up on the idea of electing their governments. Latin Americans, almost to a person, want to hold on to the right to vote out governments they don't like. There's nobody in the streets in any country in Latin America marching for the Russian model or the Chinese model. Electoral politics continues to be quite well entrenched. I think that's good news. We've gone a little bit over time. I want to thank our wonderful set of questions. I apologize we could not get to them all, but most importantly, I want to thank our three tremendous panelists, Celso Amorim, Susana Malcorra, and Thomas Shannon. We really, really appreciate your time and your great insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.